Good afternoon, everyone. This is Robert Fuentes, President and CEO of the ENO Center for Transportation. I want to welcome you to this webinar for our new report that's being released today called Life in the FASTLANE, Recommendations for Improving Federal Freight Grants. The report authors are Paul Lewis and Jeff Davis from ENO, and they'll be presenting here shortly. This work was informed by the experts of ENO's Freight Working Group, which is an advisory group focused on all matters related to freight policy. It is chaired by former Senator Norm Coleman and former Congressman Nick Rahall. The group is made up of diverse stakeholders who provide ENO with insights and perspectives on how to approach some of the most challenging freight transportation problems of the day. This particular report focuses on the long-named Fostering Advancements in Shipping and Transportation for the Long-Term Achievement of National Efficiencies Grant Program, also known as the FASTLANE Grant Program, which provides funds for highways and intermodal freight projects around the country. Jeff and Paul will share duties describing the findings and recommendations from the report, and then they will take your questions through the webinar website. I think you'll find the report and discussion today interesting and timely, and I want to thank you all again for joining us here today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff Davis from ENO.
Thank you very much, Rob. I'm going to go over a little bit of how the program got started, what people were thinking in Congress, and how it works. Very briefly, much of what Congress does in any kind of recurring authorization process is go back and fix the things that Congress messed up or went too far on in a previous iteration of the reauthorization process. This is particularly true in transportation because prior to 2011, transportation surface issues were marked by excessive congressional earmarking of projects. In 2011, Congress went cold turkey and gave this up. And then in 2012, during the MAP 21 reauthorization process, Congress thought as an institution, well, if we can't direct discretionary funding to the projects that we want, the administration shouldn't be able to either. So they went ahead and eliminated just about all of the discretionary highway projects and many of the, and the mass transit bus discretionary program as well. After a few years, Congress realized they'd probably gone too far. So the sentiment came back to at least bring back some kind of discretion for the executive branch, if not earmarks for the legislative branch. The President's Grow America proposal in 2014 and 2015 proposed a large intermodal freight program, either $1.25 billion a year or $1.5 billion a year, depending on which iteration of Grow America it was. The Senate bill that eventually became the FAST Act went a slightly different direction. They created what they called the AMP program, Assistance for Major Projects, or what would be long called mega projects in the trade. Projects that are really too big for a lot of states to be able to pay out of their formula apportionments of highway money each year. And in some instances that require states to join money across state lines is not always easy either. The Senate bill also tried to bring back earmarks by another name. They had this complicated Rube Goldberg process by which the administration would choose a list and then the Senate Public Works Committee and the House Transportation Committee would have an effective veto over the list. That had some constitutional concerns under the Supreme Court's INS v. Chadha legislative veto decision from 1983. So they wound up going with more of a system whereby the Congress would submit the President's Department of Transportation would submit a list of proposed projects for each year, and then Congress would be able to have an up or down vote on whether or not to accept the entire list or not. The House wrote its bill later and had its own kind of national significant freight and highway projects program. Now, it's important to remember, the Senate program wasn't particularly freight focused. The House program was a little more freight focused. It was a lot bigger at $743 million a year. And then they had a very hurried House Senate conference on the FAST Act and threw together the program. They called it a nationally significant highway freight program, but no one can pronounce that acronym. So the Department of Transportation renamed the program on its own extra legally and came up with its own acronym. So one of the recommendations that did not make the paper is that we call a halt to acronyming, making new acronyms in general. They're getting a little carried away with it. But in any case, the FASTLANE conference report established the program. It's now entitled 23 USC, paid for by Highway Trust Fund, Highway Account Contract Authority, that was billed when the bill was being debated as being freight focused because it took the place of another couple of proposals that had been more freight focused. And if you ask the public or the average member of Congress who wasn't involved in drafting the bill, they would have said that it was probably going to be a freight-focused discretionary program. But in fact, the program has a lot more eligibility than that. But basically, you're going to get between $850 and $875 million a year in usable contract authority over 5 years, split up a bunch of different ways. 90% has to go for large projects, but 10% is set aside for small projects. There are different criteria for urban projects versus rural projects. What Congress typically likes to do is put a vague sense of geographical diversity in there, which it's not always easy to define. The administration sent its first list of proposed projects to Congress very cleverly. They sent it about a day and a half before Congress was about to embark on its longest recess since World War II, longest summer recess. And because of that, even if there had been a sentiment in Congress to pass a resolution overriding the administration's list of project selections, there would have been no time because there was, I think, a 60-day clock on there, and Congress was in recess for just about all that time. But they awarded $759.2 million, a lot of which was really concentrated at the top end for the I-95 corridor in Northern Virginia, $165 million, and the Arlington Memorial Bridge between the District of Columbia and Arlington, $90 million for the Park Service project, which doesn't carry freight anyway. But basically, the administration they sent out the notice of funding agreement under the Obama administration for a second round of FY17 FASTLANE grants that they haven't had time to decide whether change over administration, so applications have been submitted. It's up to the new administration whether they're going to reopen that application process, maybe with some different criteria emphasis, or if they're going to stick with the previous applications and do their own judging for them. So now Paul Lewis is going to discuss sort of the process by which our Freight Working Group guided us to come up with conclusions about ways to improve the program.
Thanks, everybody. This is Paul Lewis, and I'm going to walk through some of the process we came up to analyze the program and the 2016 grants and our recommendations that we have in the paper. For a long time, we believed that competition is a really good way to target limited funding, federal funding, to projects that have the most value across the country. And the FAST Act took a really important step in establishing the FASTLANE program. And we followed the 2016 grants very closely. We thought, in general, it was very well done. And the purpose of this paper is to look at the future of the program. And unlike Tiger, where that's kind of reauthorized every year through the appropriations process, we have the FASTLANE program for the next 4 years. And so it's a tremendous opportunity to build on the program and the concept to make it better and more effective and more valuable, so that at the end of this process, we can see it continue onward. So within the report, we have several recommendations. The first one is in funding. We think that the program needs to be increased in size, which of course is something that a lot of papers around these kind of programs talk about, is increasing the funding size. We say that it needs to be at least $2 billion annually, and that's to ensure that it truly has a real impact on the national scope. And this builds on a recommendation that put out about 10 months ago in our report that talked about federal freight funding, where in the short term, Congress needs to use some general funds to support the program, and then in the long term, start developing some kind of cost of freight shipment fee that meets certain criteria that we outlined in the paper. So I encourage everyone to check that out. But it's important to note that the funding recommendation in here does have some specifics behind it. Aside from that, we talk about eligibility as well. And as Jeff just mentioned, this program has pretty broad eligibility for freight and highway projects, in large part because it's funded out of the highway account of the Highway Trust Fund. But we believe that Congress should revise the eligibility standards, particularly as they expand the program to allow for all freight projects, whether that be public and private railways, waterways, highways, ports, connectors, or any other kind of freight-focused project. And we also believe that Congress needs to restrict eligibility to only freight projects. Now, of course, there will be projects that affect other modes, or a lot of, I'm sure, highway projects that are bottlenecks that would affect both highway passenger traffic as well as freight traffic. But having a truly emphasis on freight accomplishes two things. One, it provides a better guideline for applicants so they know what they're competing against, and it kind of levels the playing field in that sense. And it's not to say that there aren't other highway projects or rail projects or anything else in the country that could be very valuable, and we need to have discretionary programs that cover those goals. But if our goal is improving freight mobility, that should be the focus of the eligibility. And then in the long term, if the freight industry is going to accept some kind of fee and placed on them to fund and expand the program size, they're going to want to see that their money is going to a program that directly benefits them. Within the project selection process, we recommend that DOT exercise greater transparency and really explicitly describe its evaluation process, assign weight to criteria, and publish the final result. This is not a criticism necessarily of the hard work that DOT put into the 2016 grant, but particularly on a very tight timeline and a very competitive atmosphere. But this is intended to be a forward-looking recommendation so that the new administration can come in and lay the groundwork for the long-term establishment of this program, and getting industry input and receiving criticism and improving the program is how these programs become better in the long run. We also think that we need to definitely emphasize the non-federal share of freight costs. So we have a recommendation that we should emphasize and perhaps increase a weight on leveraging non-federal funds, both private and public, so that we're more effectively using our public dollars, and applicants are encouraged to find their own revenue source. And so instead of relying on FASTLANE to make the project happen and kind of be the main funder of it, the FASTLANE is coming in and filling a small hole so that the project can happen sooner. When it comes to geographic distribution, we were looking at the projects. There was obviously a large emphasis on two projects in the Virginia, D.C. region. That was about a third of the overall funding, but the remaining projects were spread amongst 15 different states. So there was some kind of underlying mechanism to make sure that the projects had some kind of geographic equity. This is similar to other programs that run out of the department over the last couple of years, like Tiger, where the funding is somewhat spread around the country. And this is also important in some regards for long-term political support. But we say in here that we need to be transparent and explicit about how this is happening, and keep it to the minimum so that we're truly focusing projects on the ones that are providing the most national and regional benefit. And the last comment that we have in the paper is not really a recommendation, but it's talking about the $90 million for the Memorial Bridge. This was an undoubtedly important project. Congress and DOT shouldn't be criticized for making this happen in the absence of an earmark ban. But we also, as an industry, shouldn't focus on this project because there aren't going to be any more memorial bridges in the future, because the eligibility for that specific project has come and gone. And I think that future rounds of the grants will actually be really interesting to watch, because there'll be more opportunity to spend the annual dollars on more freight projects all over the country. So that's a brief description of our analysis and recommendations. And we are looking forward now to taking questions from the audience.
Great. Thanks very much, Paul and Jeff. So as Paul mentioned, you can submit questions via the webinar. Click on the questions button, and you can submit them that way. We've already got a couple that have come in. So let me go ahead and start, and I'll read them off for Jeff and Paul. The first question is, can you describe the current status of the program? Is the next round of FASTLANE grants currently on hold?
Yes, temporarily on hold. Again, the application deadline was last year, so we're still waiting on a decision from the Department of Transportation and Secretary Chow on if they're going to reopen that application process for the FY17 grants with any kind of revised criteria, or if they're just going to accept those grants. And also, I would say that I believe the application process for FY17 was specifically set up to encourage people who'd applied in FY16 and not received a grant. So to the extent that that also sort of addresses decisions made by the Obama administration's priorities versus Trump administration priorities, who knows? But we've not got a signal out of DOT yet. They could, fast track this and put their own list together using last year's applicants in weeks or a couple of months, or they could decide to reinvent it. We just don't know yet.
Next question deals with the projects themselves. So these projects are expensive, and so what other funding streams do the projects rely on in addition to the money coming from the FASTLANE grants?
Yeah, so the FASTLANE grants tend to fund only a portion of it. Some of them as high as 60%. There were some projects that had as low as 3%. And the other funding amounts come from a myriad of sources. Some of it is state funds. That's probably the most common. There are some private funds that go in there. If it's a public-private partnership, there can be funds from local sources as well. So it really is kind of up to the applicant. And from an eligibility standpoint, it's a state DOT, it's a local DOT, it's any other public entity that can apply for this and put together the funding packages that make the project happen.
So regarding the eligibility, you mentioned that all freight projects should be eligible in the future. So what types of freight projects are excluded currently?
Well, the problem is that there was the old sentiment that highway account of the Highway Trust Fund Contract Authority being supported by the gas tax should be exclusively or almost exclusively for highway projects that benefit highway users. Now, and so as a part of the decades-old struggle over this, the 5-year, $4.5 billion total funding for FASTLANE, the law set an aggregate $500 million 5-year cap on the amount that can be used for a lot of these rail transfer facilities and more non-highway types of projects. Now, I personally think that the debate over the sanctity of the highway account of the Highway Trust Fund has been over for a while, and some people just haven't realized it. I did some numbers this morning. The FAST Act deposited $51.9 billion in totally unrelated general fund money in the highway account of the Highway Trust Fund. And when you count up the $500 million on FASTLANE for non-highway purposes and the average $1.1 billion a year of highway fund money that gets flexed to mass transit, that's $6 billion. So that's $8.65 of general fund deposits into the Highway Trust Fund over the life of the FAST Act for every $1 that is spent on non-highway purposes. So if, the political inertia reasons aside, the amount of unrelated general fund money from robbing the Federal Reserve or selling Strategic Petroleum Reserve or whatever that has gone to make the FAST Act possible and support spending out of the highway account really does justify significantly higher spending on multimodal freight movement that's not specifically highway oriented.
And to add to that, if you look at the eligibility standards on page 3 and 4 of the report, it's very much emphasized highway projects or freight highway projects, and even on the intermodal connectors that are eligible for a portion of it, there's a maximum that intermodal rail projects can apply, but they have to any intermodal or rail project have to make a significant improvement the freight movement on the national highway freight network. So it's very much emphasizing the highway side of things, which it excludes a lot of private rail projects or inland waterway projects or projects that happen to be 100% on a certain port facility or something of that nature.
Related to freight rail, there's a question. since most of the railroad infrastructure is privately owned, what would be the government's role in funding those kinds of new projects?
So there are a lot of the infrastructure is definitely on the private side, and it's been a long time private responsibility, but there are lots of highway grade crossings or grade separation projects or other connectors between railroads that can help out shippers, but don't necessarily make sense within the business model of the private railroad. And so a lot of times, if you look at the Tiger program, they went to fund a couple intermodal facilities and the CREATE program in Chicago and other connectors that can separate freight traffic from rail passenger traffic. So there are a lot of instances where private investment doesn't necessarily result in some of the broader public need projects that we have.
And considering that the way the federal government paid to build the Transcontinental Railroad in the first place was to buy land from Napoleon Bonaparte at 3 cents an acre, declare war on Mexico and take their land, and then give that land to private companies in exchange for building a transcontinental railroad. So to the extent that these intermodal freight railroad facilities and rights of way, the land was the original federal investment. It was not a cash investment. It was that land in the first place. You know, if you look at it historically, there's a good bit of line blurring between the real estate owned by these private freight companies and public money going back to the 1860s.
We get a history lesson here today, too. So given that this is a discretionary grant program, which of these particular projects stand out to you as being the best ones in the FASTLANE program? Do any stand out as being particularly good?
We did not go deep into every single application, so it would be hard for us to judge which one is the best, which one is not the best. But again, our emphasis here is on transformational freight projects that do a good job of leveraging federal funds. And so if you look at page 5 and the list there are a couple of projects there that certainly would stand out on that list.
However, there were some very vocal complaints about the original selection process from a national freight movement perspective, just because you didn't really see anything on there much about the two gigantic elephants in the room, which are getting containers in and out of the port of Long Beach, Los Angeles, San Pedro port complex, and freight going through the Chicago bottleneck on rail and getting things and moved in and out that way. So there were some very vocal complaints by a lot of the freight corridor people about the lack of the presence of those two areas on the list, given their outsized relationship to a total freight movement in the country.
Do you know if those projects were applied for funding?
It's hard to tell. It's hard to get public lists out of DOT of a lot of the application process. So it's one of the reasons we do emphasize transparency of this process in our recommendations. We make analysis like that a lot easier.
So we don't have an analysis of the criteria that was used to award these projects?
Well, they have the criteria. They don't tell you the weighting. One criteria could be 5%, could be 40%. And if you don't know that, then knowing the existence of the criteria without the weighting is not particularly helpful.
Which is why we need more transparency in the project. So let me combine a couple questions here. In the absence of an increase in the fuel tax, where do we think the money from the FASTLANE projects are going to come from? And are there any prospects for increased funding for the program?
So, go ahead.
I'm reminded of something that Ronald Reagan said when he was asked where the money for his proposed defense buildup in 1981 was going to come from. He said, from the economy. So, there's always that. But we're still in really uncharted waters here as far as what the eventual proposal from President Trump is going to look like in terms of real private equity versus federal leverage versus federal tax dollars. So we're also waiting to see how President Trump proposes to deal with the Budget Control Act spending cap on the discretionary budget that is actually supposed to be smaller in 2018 than it was in 2017. So until we get a little bit of clarity, so hopefully the budget director will be confirmed tomorrow maybe, and then or Thursday, and then we'll have someone running the White House budget process that can get us a budget by April, and then try to figure out where some of this comes from.
Great. So there's a lot of talk about performance grants, meaning beyond just providing grant assistance for important projects, the federal government should incentivize or reward life cycle approaches to it. So how do we support projects that actually spend smarter as opposed to just spending more?
So that's a great question, and I think an important part that we've talked about in a couple of our reports over the last couple of years, and I think making sure that these projects do emphasize long-term sustainability from a maintenance standpoint, and they're addressing some of those longer-term concerns and not just the initial construction of the project, is very important. And perhaps that becomes part of the criteria or part of the application in future year grants. I think that's a good idea.
And so in addition to transparency, what are the major flaws of the existing FASTLANE program today?
I mean, we really kind of outlined what we were talking about. I think that it could be more robust in terms of size. I think that it also it needs to expand its eligibility to all different kinds of freight projects and freight project owners, and while restricting it to that purpose. And I think in general that process is really just revolving it around a central goal. And if the goal is improving the flow of freight on the national network, it should be irrespective of mode, of location, of how you get there. You should be using limited federal dollars to that end, and then structuring the evaluation criteria around that.
Okay, last question. Can you describe the connection between the cost of freight shipment fee and the FASTLANE program?
So the cost of freight shipment fee was a recommendation that came out of a report from May of 2016. This was the result of a lot of dialogue back and forth with ENO's Freight Working Group, and with the explicit purpose of that we need to have a federal discretionary investment program for freight. FASTLANE came along very shortly thereafter, or very shortly before that, actually, and we feel like they're very complementary. The cost of freight shipment fee does not need to fund FASTLANE per se, but FASTLANE does provide a platform to start building that program in the short term, so that as we work through some of the caveats and some of the remaining questions we have before we actually get to any kind of cost of freight shipment fee, we can have a program that we can build on.
That's great. All right, folks, we're just about out of time, so I want to thank you all very much for your participation on the webinar here today. We had an excellent attendance and a very, very rich conversation. So, as I mentioned, this report was informed by the experts on our Freight Working Group. If you would like more information on the group, including how to join, please feel free to contact any of us or by email at publicaffairs@enotrans.org. That's publicaffairs@enotrans.org. I also want to encourage you to subscribe to Eno Transportation Weekly, a really invaluable resource for all aspects of transportation policy and practice across all modes across the whole country, including freight. This particular report can be found on Eno's website. And again, I want to thank you all for joining us here today. I want to thank Paul and Jeff for their insights, and we look forward to working with you all. Have a great day.